Hello and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a show about taking the path less traveled, about investigating life's mysteries and some of the strange things that happen in our world. My name is Dan Hall. I'm your host for tonight. Gwen Farrell and Dave Jinks, my co-hosts, they had other obligations tonight, so they're going to miss out on a very important conversation. I'm really pleased to welcome to our show Drew Beeson. And the reason I asked Drew to come on the show was he's written a book about the Zodiac murders, something that has fascinated me for many, many moons. So, Drew, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us tonight.
Thanks for having me on, Dan.
Sure, sure. So, how long have you been an author?
About 5 years.
Have
Just kind of a hobby.
hobby? Okay. So, how did you get into that? And have you written, obviously, the book about the Zodiac is a nonfiction work. Have you written fiction pieces as well?
I wrote one book that was mostly fictional. Mhm.
So, what drives you to be an author?
I guess just wanting to solve classic American unsolved mysteries is what kind of drove me into it. Just the fascination with the unsolved aspect, who it could be. All the mystique around certain cases, especially the Zodiac Killer is probably the top of that list. Just it has so much mystique around it and mystery.
Yeah, that's something that resonated with me. I think I might have mentioned that I used to work in the criminal justice system and taught criminology for a while, and just was totally fascinated by the Zodiac killings rather. So maybe, and this is for the benefit of our audience, differentiating between serial killers and mass murderers. What kind of distinction would you make about that? What category would the Zodiac fall into?
A serial killer Zodiac Killer would definitely fall in the serial killer category, for sure. This is just over a certain set of numbers and not just one mass incident, which could be a mass murderer. It could be someone that killed 10 people at once. A serial killer is more over time planning and things like that. So he would definitely fall into the serial killer category.
Yeah, it seems he would. Um, so one of the problems sometimes with serial killers is identifying who actually are the victims. Now, what I know about is there are probably 7 people who were identified as being victims of the Zodiac, and 2 of those people lived, but 5 of them didn't. So how did they go about figuring out who the Zodiac killed and who he didn't kill?
Well, there's just like what you said, there's 7 known victims. 2 of them survived. There's 4 canonical Zodiac crimes that started in 1968 and went on through 1969. And then, of course, there was a series of communications sent in by the Zodiac Killer, claiming to be the killer of or the attacker of these 7 individuals. So that's how it kind of all ties in.
And as I recall, he sent letters to various different media outlets, but he actually called some police departments and claimed to be responsible for the murders. Is that correct as well?
That's correct. He made a phone call after 2 of the canonical crimes, one at Blue Rock Springs Park that happened on July 4th of 1969, and another phone call he made after an attack at a place called Lake Berryessa up near Napa, September 27th of 1969. He also made a phone call after that attack, claiming the murders and also claiming the previous attacks. And he also at Lake Berryessa wrote on the car door. He wrote all the dates, starting with the first attack at Lake Herman Road on December 20th of 1968, and then he wrote the date of the next attack, July 4th at Blue Rock Springs, and then that was the third attack at the time. He wrote out September 27th, marking the attack that he had just committed on that day.
So he claimed responsibility for a lot of those things. Um, to talk a little bit about the victims, what could you share about the victims, the ones that died and also the 2 that survived?
Yeah, these were all really good kids, as you would call them. These were The first was a couple out on their first date after a pre-Christmas concert. It was a girl named Betty Lou Jensen and her date, David Arthur Faraday. He was 17 years old. She was 16 years old. Just everything I know about them is they were just extremely good kids that were not mixed up in anything bad. David was really high up in the Boy Scouts. He was an Eagle Scout and did all things scouting. Betty Lou was also involved in lots of charity type organizations and just solid kids all the way up and down. These were not people out doing drugs or drinking or running afoul of the law. They were two really good kids just out on a first date when this happened to them. And I truly believe that they were just at the wrong place at the wrong time, as is the rest of the victims in the Zodiac Killer case. The second crime at Blue Rock Springs Park, of course, it happened on July 4th, 1969 in Vallejo, California. You had a lady named Darlene Farron, and she was out with a friend of hers named Mike Michaud. Now, Darlene was married at the time, and she kind of dated around even as a married woman. And that kind of unfortunately brings in this whole universe of potential targets because, maybe there was an ex-jealous boyfriend, a jealous husband, who just appeared on a documentary I was on, which was interesting. They actually found him and he spoke about it, but I do not think he was her killer. But unfortunately, she was a very social person. She worked at a place called Terry's Waffle House in Vallejo and was a very friendly waitress. So her social circle was big. And unfortunately, that opens up a giant rabbit hole in this case of potential people that may or may not have known her. Was she a target? Were the rest of the murders just something to cover up that particular crime? So that's kind of the story on them. Mike Michaud was a little younger than her, but was basically said he was in love with Darlene. He definitely wanted to date her. So did his twin brother Steven. He was also interested in her. And Mike would kind of get into, had some trouble with the law, and he definitely had a lot of trouble with the law after this attack because it left some, really bad scars on him. He did survive, of course, but he was shot up pretty bad, and he had kind of a life of, a lot of credit card fraud in and out of jail. Unfortunately, I'm not even sure where he is today. He's still alive, as far as I know, but we're not even real sure where he is now. But that's kind of the story on that. The third couple was a gentleman named Brian Hartnell, who had run into his ex-girlfriend, Cecilia Shepard. They used to go to college together, and they had dated. And they just by chance ran into each other the very day they were attacked at Pacific Union College, and they were just kind of hanging out and wanted to, kind of rekindling that flame just for a one day kind of thing. While they had run into each other, they were going to go into San Francisco that day and spend some time together, but they didn't have enough time to make it there. So just on a lark, knowing they couldn't make it into the city, decided to go to a place called Lake Berryessa and have a little, just lay out on a blanket and talk and kind of enjoy each other's company. And then they wound up getting attacked by the Zodiac Killer that day. But two good college students, very, very well liked, both of them, pretty social people. Like I said, they were just at the wrong place at the wrong time. I think the day was important to Zodiac, but not necessarily the people. They had to be the right people at the right time. Of course, the first three attacks were couples. You could consider the first two attacks lovers' lanes, and then the other two were basically kind of on a lake beachfront type atmosphere. And then there was a departure on October 11th of 1969 where a sole cab driver named Paul E. Stein was shot and killed while driving his cab, which is considered the last canonical Zodiac attack. So this is different. This is a male by himself, didn't have a female with him. He was plainly executed in his cab, and the killer managed to slip out and get away from that attack. So, but all that's known about Paul Stein is a person is just like the others, a very good guy. I mean, he was married at the time. He was working his way up to better his life. He had gone to college at Fresno State. I actually knew one of his professors at Fresno State, talked to him a long time about Paul Stein. He just told me he was the sweetest man he ever knew. And that really, resonated with me. And he said, when I heard that he was killed by the Zodiac, I wanted to go kill the Zodiac myself. He goes, that's how I felt about Paul Stein. He just loved him that much. Just a really good guy. So I was fortunate to get to meet someone that knew him well. And that's it for the victims. Very good people. They didn't deserve what happened whatsoever.
Well, who would, I guess. So is there any significance that there was kind of a change in the pattern? The first three acts involve couples, and then obviously Paul Stein is by himself. do you put any credence in any change in the pattern, or what do you make of that?
The pattern was always changing. Lake Berryessa was the first daytime attack. Lake Herman Road was at night. Blue Rock Springs Park was at night. Of course, that's two couples. Those were both gun attacks. So there was two were the most similar, although there was the most time between them, from going from December of '68 all the way up to the end, or the beginning of July of '69. So there's a pretty good gap in between those two. But Lake Berryessa was a daytime crime, and he committed it with a knife. It was a stabbing attack and not using a gun. So the MO changed. And then, of course, Paul Stein was a male by himself, so he was constantly changing his MO as he went along. And I don't know if that was just something he wanted to do or just to make it harder to catch him.
Right. So in the first two killings, was a similar gun used?
The first gun in the first killing was of course they found the shells from it. It was from a 22 long rifle shell casings, and it was a 9mm used at Blue Rock Springs Park. So it was a different weapon used between those two crimes.
And what do they know about Paul Stein's killing, the weapon used?
Paul Stein was also a 9mm. But that's another thing about this case. Nothing lines up with the others. There's no matching shell casings between two of the crimes. None of the fingerprints, which are all partials for the most part, don't tie two of the crimes together. There's really nothing there's no physical evidence that ties any of the two crimes together. None.
As a cab driver, you would think maybe that Paul Stein would have had some kind of money in his cab. Was there any evidence that was a precipitating factor in the attack on him, or?
No, his wallet was missing. They don't know how much money was in it, but they think he took it as a souvenir. Of course, when the crime happened, they just assumed it was a robbery when the police showed up. They did not consider it to be a Zodiac Killer attack until a letter showed up to the San Francisco Chronicle that contained a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt in it, which were three different correspondences that showed up with a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt in them.
Really? That's very intriguing. So who is Sherry Jo Bates, and why should she not be attached to the Zodiac?
Sherry Jo Bates was a college student. She went to Riverside College. It was a junior college where she was from, the town of Riverside, which is in Southern California. So the attacks we were just talking about were all in the Bay Area of San Francisco, the Napa area of Vallejo. Two of the attacks, Benicia is just right by Vallejo, of course, and then you had downtown San Francisco, the Presidio Heights. Of course, Riverside is closer to Los Angeles, so that's a departure there. But the Bates, she was attacked and murdered in 1966 on Halloween Eve, the day before Halloween, 1966. And that got tied in on a tip on a letter that was sent to a San Francisco Chronicle reporter named Paul Avery. Got a tip that might be a Zodiac attack. It was called the Slow Boat to China letter because that was actually referenced in the letter. And so they went down there, investigated it, and people thought that sounded like a Zodiac attack. And then in one of Zodiac's later correspondences, he said the phrase, "I see you have stumbled upon my Riverside activity." So obviously he's making a reference to the Sherry Jo Bates attack. And that one's been kind of hotly debated among people in the Zodiac community, if that's an actual Zodiac attack or just something that he wanted to claim. Maybe he just had knowledge of it and claimed it. I can tell you that the Riverside Police Department till this day firmly believes it was her ex-boyfriend, who is still alive. He actually lives in Guam. They have some DNA from the Sherry Jo Bates attack, and his ex-boyfriend of hers came back to visit the Riverside area, and immediately when he came into the airport, I don't remember, this is a number of years ago, they took him in to get his DNA tested to give a sample, and he supposedly made the comment, "I don't know what took you guys so long." So tested his DNA, it was negative. But that being outstanding, they still believe it's him. I can tell you that they are pretty firm in their belief that it's not a Zodiac crime, and that it's most likely him. And maybe he had an accomplice or a friend of his at the time that maybe that's their DNA. or something else. I don't know if they're holding on to anything that they haven't released. But one thing that came out in that is there was something called the Bates. There was a letter that was titled "Bates Had to Die." It was a handwritten letter, and they did get DNA off the flap of the envelope with that particular letter, and they were able to get a full genealogical trace on that letter through the genetic genealogy. Found the letter writer, and they never identified who it was, but they firmly ruled him out as not only the killer of Bates, but also not being able to be the Zodiac Killer. So I don't know if that's because he was too young. Of course, he said at the time this was just a sick joke, but they believed him. And we still don't know who he is. It was such a poorly written press release about that particular letter. Of course, there was other letters written regarding the Bates crime. So there was letters sent in after her murder, which made people more, think that sounds like Zodiac. Of course, Zodiac mentioned her by name in a letter called the Bates Confession Letter and this kind of thing. And Zodiac never mentioned any of his victims by name. So that's one thing that would point against Bates being a Zodiac crime. I personally don't think it is. I think it's just something he was aware of and wanted to take credit for it.
How did Sherry Jo Bates die?
It was a stabbing. She was stabbed. She was at the library. She came out to her car. I can't remember. It was somewhere around 8:30 p.m. She was studying. She drove a Volkswagen Beetle at the time, and someone had disengaged her distributor cap. Had some knowledge of automobiles, but I guess a lot of guys did back then, and she was unable to start her car. So what it looks like is her assailant, knew that she wouldn't be able to get away in her car and probably approached her and said, "Hey, let me help you with that," and somehow coerced her into going away with him for a period of time. And then that's when she was stabbed in an alleyway not too far from where the car was found. So there's some indication that she may have known her assailant, which again could point back to her ex-boyfriend. But it was a vicious stabbing. I don't remember how many times she was stabbed, but I would say it was far more vicious than the stabbing by the Zodiac at Lake Berryessa. I think she was almost decapitated. It was absolutely a anger killing, like somebody that knew her that was very angry. And the story goes is that she had left to go to San Francisco and got engaged to another guy other than a guy she was dating, and that he heard about that and just really lost his cool, and that was a motivation for his attack on her.
So let's talk about the symbology of the Zodiac. So where does the symbol, and I'm thinking of a couple things. I'm thinking of the references in the letter. I'm thinking at Lake Berryessa, this guy comes out of the woods with a hood on, with some kind of a symbol on his on this hood. Where does this symbology or symbols of the Zodiac, where does that come in? Any speculation about that?
Well, where it first comes in were the first letters that were written by the Zodiac in July of 1969. It's before he actually used the word Zodiac. And at the bottom of the letter, you saw what we call the cross circle logo, which is a circle with the cross through it, and the cross extends through the circle. Right. It looks like a gun sight. And that's one of the things some people think it could be related to. But that's where it first shows up in one of the letters. The word Zodiac's not used, but the symbol truly converts to the word Zodiac. And that's where it's first used. And then what we call the debut of the Zodiac letter, which I think arrived on August 4th of 1969, is where he finally said the phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking." And then he used the cross circle as well. So that's the first time both were used. So we're talking a lot of months after the first canonical attack at Lake Herman Road before you see either that cross circle or the name Zodiac. And there's no shortage of theories on where the symbol comes from.
Yeah, because I think I saw some kind of reference to a watch that was called the Zodiac watch. And I mean, it wasn't necessarily related to the killings, but that was where somebody speculated that the symbol could have come from that watch.
That's my belief. That's my personal belief. I think it comes from a wristwatch. Of course, it's called the Zodiac brand wristwatch, where it's called Zodiac, the name Zodiac spelled out, and it uses that little cross circle logo on the wristwatch. And the watches have been made since the late 1800s. They're still made to this day. It's a higher end wristwatch. It was back in the day. It still is. Today they run about, I don't know, anywhere from $800 up to $1,500 watches. Pretty expensive. And they were pretty expensive back in the day. They were popular with skin divers, but it's one of the only places you will find in the annals of history where the name Zodiac is accompanied with that particular logo, is the wristwatch. Now, of
Wow.
course, all you had to do was see an ad for that watch in a magazine and then adopted it. That's simple enough. But in this case, the prime suspect owned that very model wristwatch that he got as a Christmas gift for Christmas of 1967. So that obviously predates all the attacks and absolutely predates the debut of Zodiac, where the name is used and the cross circles used together for the first time in early August of '69. So it's interesting that the prime suspect did own that watch that many years before the actual first crime.
I'm very interested in the fact that the Zodiac communicated with the media. And the other kind of tie-in here is a very similar but really different cases. The Jack the Ripper murders in London in the 1800s. Whomever the Ripper was communicated with the media too. So what's trying to characterize the letters that the Zodiac sent? He sent them to more than one media outlet, is that correct?
Right. The main places were the three Bay Area newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times Herald, which of course
And what
Vallejo
did he
was
say?
kind of ground zero.
What did he say
Uh,
besides maybe claiming responsibility for some of these
they
murders?
were very taunting. They were taunting in nature, kind of, this catch me if you can. Some of the letters described, he was trying to take credit for these murders and kind of wanted to prove it was him. So he said, to prove I was a killer, in the first three letters, he described what were at the crime scenes of Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs Park. He said the girl was wearing a patterned slacks, and I shot the boy 4 times, and he's just kind of describing some of the details. And he said I used a 9mm at Blue Rock Springs Park, and so he's just trying to put some details in there to get credibility, to prove that he was actually the assailant for those first 2 crimes.
Didn't he threaten to do some other things like shoot kids as they come off of a bus and some other outlandish, basically a fear tactic to
Yes. In his later letters, he was threatening to shoot school children. He said he was going to pick off the little kiddies, as he said. He said he would pick off the little kiddies as they come bouncing off the school bus. And of course, I talked to people that lived in San Francisco at the time, and they remember those threats. Police were following the buses around, and they very much took them seriously. He had a letter once we called the bus bomb letter, where he was actually going to bomb a school bus. And he showed the device, how the bomb was going to be set up. So yeah, they got very threatening. It was actually a terrorism campaign when it came to those particular correspondences.
wow. Let's talk a little bit about the ciphers. I guess that's the correct word. The coded messages that Zodiac sent. He sent those along with the letters.
Well, the first set of letters came with a 3-part cipher. So there was 3 pretty much identical letters that went to the 3 different newspapers: Vallejo Times, Herald, Chronicle, and the Examiner. And they were just slightly different, basically saying the same thing. But with each letter came 1/3 of a cipher that, when all 3 put together, would make up the entire cipher. And it's called the 408 cipher because there was 408 symbols in that cipher. And it quickly got cracked by a school teacher named Don Harden and his wife. Pretty soon after it was published. Yeah, they just sat down at their kitchen table and thought, oh, this guy's going to be a big ego guy. He's going to say the word I a lot. He's going to probably use the word kill, which of course, and they were able to do a couple of the more simpler letters. Of course, the beginning of that cipher Dakota was, I like killing people. It's more fun than killing wild game in the forest. And it went on like that. So they were able to decipher that. And just as they had done that, someone anonymously under the name Concerned Citizen sent in a cipher key that would have, be used by the police that could decipher that particular coded message. And it was very, similar. If you translated using that particular key, it would be, the Hardens did a pretty good job. It was almost 100% accurate. But using this key that was sent in by Concerned Citizen, it would only been slightly different. I firmly believe that the real Zodiac had sent in that key. Maybe he didn't predict that it would get solved as fast as it did by this husband and wife, and he felt embarrassed about it, so he sent in a key really closely to it to kind of upstage it. I don't know, but I truly believe the Zodiac was the one that sent in that key called Concerned Citizen Key.
Were all of the codes solved? Were there any?
No. The ones of there are only two of linked, and that's the 408 because the 408 symbols. The others called the 340 or 340 symbols. So those are the only two of any major linked. And of course, the 340 was solved about 2.5, 3 years ago by a team of three different guys. One is an American named Dave Moranchek, who kind of headed up the team. Another guy named Jarl van Eck from Belgium, who was doing the computer codes and stuff, and actually creating a computer program to help break that particular cipher. And then a mathematician from Australia named Sam Blake. So it was an extremely smart team of private citizens, three guys headed up by the American Dave Moranchek, that were able to break that cipher. And it took over 50 years to break it, and it stood but numerous attacks by the lay hobbyists. I mean, just obsessed with trying to break it, because the 408 was already broken. Other than there's still some symbols at the bottom of the 408 that were still not solved to this day, but it took over 50 years to crack the 340.
What did those later codes reveal? What new information, if anything?
It didn't give many clues at all to his identity. He said there was back in 1971, there was a TV show called The Phil Dunbar Show. I think it was based out of San Francisco. And there was a caller to that show that was claiming to be the Zodiac Killer. Of course, this person later turned out to be a mental patient. They were able to find him. I don't remember how they did it. I don't think they traced the call, but they found that he was in a kind of a mental institution, and they were able to rule him out. But one of the things that the letter revealed was he said that he was not the caller to the Phil Dunbar Show. Was one of the things that came out in that. And other than that, it was this usual Zodiac speak. It was I will not, I won't be going to the gas chamber. He always spoke of having slaves in the afterlife. The last two words were paradise, death. I mean, there's nothing that revealed his identity, other than the fact that it was a valid cipher. There was a valid message within the 340, and some people had argued that it was just gibberish, but it wasn't. It was just a lot better constructed than the 408.
I was watching some video the other day about the Zodiac, and the implication was made that the Zodiac murders and the person that committed the Zodiac murders, and the letter writers were two different people. What would you say to that?
Right. Was that the myth of the Zodiac Killer?
Yeah, it might have been. Yeah,
was it on Peacock? Yeah, did you see me? I'm in that quite a bit. I was kind of turned out to be the case expert, which I didn't expect to be. But yeah, that's based on what's called the myth of the Zodiac Killer. It's a theory that's from a gentleman named Thomas Henry Horan, who's a good friend of mine. And that TV show was based on his book called The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, where there's a separate letter writer from the attacker. And he has, it's always a theory that I was asked by multiple people to debunk early on years ago. Like, hey, this guy's crazy. Why don't you take that on and debunk it? And I said, why? This theory has absolute validity to be in a case that's over 50 years old, not solved. And there is, go back to your show title, there's a lot of anomalies in this case. It absolutely is right for something like a hoax theory, which it's not saying that people didn't die. It's just saying that each crime in itself was somebody different doing that crime, and then somebody separate wanting to take credit for it to kind of create this boogeyman of a Zodiac. And in Horan's theory, it's a Napa police detective named Hal Snook actually wrote the letters. And then a gentleman named Dennis Land, who was a park ranger at Lake Berryessa, actually did that attack. And then he doesn't say all this for 100%, but this is just kind of how he thinks it may have played out. But he thinks that Darlene Farron's ex-boyfriend, a guy named Michael Crabtree, or James Phillips Crabtree, his name goes around 300 different ways, but he's part of that documentary that we're in. And they actually interview him. Of course, he denies being the killer of his ex-wife. He said, man, I was already divorced from her for 2 years. I was doing LSD somewhere in the Haight-Ashbury, that wasn't me. But it's interesting to hear his denials. But that's basically what that theory is. It's called the hoax theory. And I've always felt that certain parts of that could be correct because, like I said, you cannot tie you cannot definitively tie any two of the crimes together. You can't 100% say that the attacker at Lake Berryessa was the attacker at Lake Herman Road. You can't. The police at the time believed that, though. They believed that they had no reason not to believe that this was the same person that committed all 4 crimes because, one, he was confessing to it. But number 2, it just made sense to them, but there was no physical evidence connecting any two together. No fingerprints, no ballistics. The ballistics didn't match. This is all true. In the case of Lake Berryessa, where Professor Horn thinks it could have been Dennis Land, well, it's kind of an interesting case because Dennis Land, as the park ranger there, after they were Brian and Cecilia were stabbed, they were on a blanket, blanket laying by each other and had some items on the blanket. Dennis Land actually collected up the blanket with all the items in it and took it back to park headquarters because he thought he was doing a good thing. Well, he basically just wiped out the crime scene.
Now, the crime scene, he wasn't
Yeah, which was a big no-no. And a lot of people say he would have known better. He was a former MP, military police. So why did he do that? So there's a lot of little reasons why you can kind of go with the theory like that. And I've never been critical of it.
Without necessarily getting into potential suspects, how would you characterize and maybe you don't feel comfortable doing this, that's okay. Characterize the psychology of this person. If it was in truth a single perpetrator of these crimes, what would you say psychologically about this person?
I'd say a very gifted underachiever, someone that had some kind of psychological misgivings. I don't think it was someone that would be a complete psychopath like they believe in the day. I think this was somebody that was highly organized, highly intelligent, and just had some basically insecurities, maybe from childhood. I don't know, just basically had a lot of deep rooted insecurity about how their life was playing out. And it was kind of this: I'm going to commit the perfect crime to show you how smart I am, and I'm going to taunt you with it just to make myself feel good. I think he was a pathological liar and just someone that could pretty much get along in society enough on the outside, but had a lot of hate inside. It's kind of the picture I get from this individual that did this.
You're probably familiar with David Fincher's film, The Zodiac.
Oh, very, very much so.
Yeah. So I think that's one thing that kind of got my juices going after I watched that. Is that accurate from your knowledge?
Well, the film is based off of a book called Zodiac by Robert Graysmith, and then he later wrote a book called Zodiac Unmasked, which is also pretty good. And Robert Graysmith took some liberties in what he did. A lot of it is accurate, and it's very compelling. He made a lot of money selling that book. And, of course, it became a major film by David Fincher that came out in 2007. I think most of it was filmed in 2006, but it was released in 2007. And, of course, the main point of the book and what you come away believing after watching the movie was that it was most likely still to the day prime suspect Arthur Lee Allen. And that's because there's so much good circumstantial evidence that points to Arthur Lee Allen. Now, although Graysmith took some liberties, I'll just give a couple of examples. I mean, one was that Arthur Lee Allen's family had a family meeting and they talked about the possibility that he was Zodiac or believed he was Zodiac. That wasn't true. He also talked about a painting party at Darlene Farron's place in Vallejo where they had just moved in with her husband and she had a young daughter at the time. And there's all these cast of characters were apparently at this painting party, that he came up with. And the painting party never happened. I'll tell you right now, there was no painting party. That's just something that Graysmith put in there for whatever reason. But he got a lot of it right. And it is correct to try to focus on Arthur Lee Allen because most of what is portrayed in the film and about Allen is true. He owned that watch and he was proud of that watch. When he was questioned, they show that scene in the movie where he's being questioned, where he has a job as a junior chemist, and they show him wearing that wristwatch when he's being questioned by police. That's crazy. Why would you do that? It's like he enjoyed being looked at as a suspect. That's true. He would wear that watch. Arthur Lee Allen was known to misspell words for comedic effect. They, when they first searched his house, they found a groceries list that said eggs on it, and it was spelled AIGS. Arthur Lee Allen went by the nickname Big Al, and he would sign some letters big, BEEGAL, Big Al. It couldn't be BEG because that'd be beg, but BEEG sounds like big. So it was phonetically, if you looked at the word and tried to say the word phonetically, it would sound right, but it was spelled differently. Well, gee, guess who else did that? The Zodiac Killer. That's a stunning similarity to own that the killer had, because this is stuff that Allen did before the first letters show up. He was already known to do this, to misspell words for comedic effect, where you had read it and sound the same phonetically. Those words are planted throughout the Zodiac correspondence all over. He would spell Christmas with Zodiac would spell. He said in one of his letters, "Happy Christmas" with 2 S's at the end of Christmas. Well, his own sister-in-law said that he had sent her a Christmas card years before the first murder at Lake Herman Road that said, it's probably Merry Christmas, but the Christmas had 2 S's on it. Allen would shorten the phrase trigger mechanisms to trigger mech. His sister-in-law, Karen Allen, said I remember him using the words trigger mech. So there's way too much going on with Arthur Lee Allen to throw him away and just say this is all a big coinky dink, So they got that part right, because I am telling you that Allen is involved in these crimes.
He was a sex offender that was in a Atascadero State Hospital. It seemed like something I came across referenced that too, right?
Yeah, he was in a Atascadero State Hospital, which was considered a prison, being in jail. It wasn't an actual prison. It was a state hospital, like you mentioned. And he was there for a while on a molestation conviction from basically fondling with a 13-year-old boy. He had done it to another 13-year-old boy that he got caught for. It was two different times with I think one was 12 and one was 13. They were both boys. I think that was his preference. And when he got caught with those boys, he basically told them, he'd lure them in with money or some drugs or marijuana, things like that. He had a trailer and where he did it. He also lived at 32 Fresno Street with his mother still in Vallejo, but he had 2 trailers where he could go be alone with whoever he was doing this with. The main one was in Santa Rosa, which they show in the film. But he would basically tell these young boys, "Hey, just don't tell your mother." He didn't threaten to kill them. He never pulled a knife on these boys. He never pulled a gun on these boys. He just basically said, don't tell your mom. Well, what happened? One of them told their mom, and the other wound up telling their mom, and he goes to prison at Atascadero, which is pretty much how he wound up there. And of course, famously, when the times lapsed, but there was no Zodiac letters being written or coming out at the time that he was there. There was I think a 2.5, 3-year gap in the letters showing up.
Coincidentally, possibly. Huh?
Mm-hmm.
But he was never charged with the Zodiac murders. And it seemed to me he died of a heart attack or something like that.
He had kidney failure, but I think it was a cardiac event that he finally passed away from. He was on kidney dialysis. His kidneys were failing. He had a lot of medical problems.
Were there any other suspects that kind of rose to the level of Arthur Lee Allen, or was he the primary?
In my opinion, there's only one.
Yeah.
There's only one. And this is my theory. This is what my interest in the case is. My theory is that the person that rises to a higher level than Allen is obviously someone that knew him and knew him well, because there's too much stuff with Allen circulating around the Zodiac universe. So this has to be someone that knows him. Well, the person that knew him really well, especially at the time, was the person that brought him forward as a suspect in July of 1971. That was his good friend, Don Cheney. And Cheney's portrayed in the movie by this little skinny guy. I don't know why, because Don Cheney was 6 feet tall. He was barrel-chested guy. Cheney's the one that got the ball rolling with Arthur Lee Allen when he comes forward with the help of his friend Santo Panzarella. They're living down in Southern California at the time. And apparently Cheney, by his own story, says that he was living in Pomona, California at the time, tried to go tell them, like, something jarred Don Cheney's memory, as he says, reading the newspaper when he was at work one day, and he remembered Oh, I remember Arthur Lee Allen saying something about picking off the little darlings. He changes it kitties to darlings, as they come off the school bus. So he that jars his memory. He tells his friend Sandy Panzarella, who remembers Allen because they all went to college with Arthur Lee Allen's younger brother Ronald Allen at Cal Poly Pomona. So Sandy Panzarella heads all this up, contacts SFPD with Detective Toshke and Detective Armstrong, and they said, "Hey, my friend Don here says he remembers Arthur Lee Allen telling him on New Year's Day of 1968." That's important because Don Cheney will later change that to New Year's Day '69 because he got his story got messed up. He couldn't, but he says on New Year's Day 1968. I went over to his house and he told me that he wanted to become a killer. He couldn't find a job after being laid off from Valley Springs from inappropriately touching children. He said he's going to call himself the Zodiac. He's going to kill couples on lovers' lanes. He drove me over to Blue Rock Springs Park and showed me where he was going to kill a couple. After that, he came back around Lake Herman Road and showed me where he was going to kill a couple. And he told me about putting a flashlight on a gun. And of course, that comes out in the Zodiac Killer letter. So it was all perfectly laid out. So if you believe Don Cheney, then like Robert Graysmith says in the documentary, his name was Arthur Lee Allen that came out with the feature film, you have to believe that Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac Killer if Don Cheney's telling the truth, because he says that he told him all this stuff before the first murder. The problem is Don Cheney's not reliable, and his story starts getting cracks in it, especially when he decides to move his timeline from New Year's Day '68 up till 1969. And then you get into the whole case of, well, why is Don Cheney a better suspect than Arthur Allen? Well, he is for a lot of reasons. Number one is there's so many markers of mathematics in the Zodiac correspondences. He talks about radians in one of his letters, in inches along the radians where he's going to plant this bus bomb. He shows a compass rose over Mount Diablo, showing knowledge of celestial navigation. He's doing ciphers, and what are ciphers? Or math or codes or mathematical codes. This is the way the Zodiac did those ciphers were very tedious. Very tedious the way he wrote the symbols. Or if you look at them, if you look at just a picture of the 408 or the 340, the original, you can see they're in these perfectly neat rows. Well, that's what was done using a light table and graph paper under the piece of paper on top of it, so he could see, make it perfectly laid out. But there's evidence that's just overwhelming. Even if I'm wrong, whoever the Zodiac was knew how to draft. He was a draftsman. He could use a set of nibs. He could use different weights of strokes and things like that. Arthur Lee Allen was a very smart guy, but he just does not have a mathematical background whatsoever. He never did. Back in the day, when those guys were coming up, you knew what your strengths were, and that's what you would go do for a living. If your strengths were mathematics, you would be into something like Don Cheney was. Don Cheney was a mechanical engineer, and there's so many hallmarks of mechanical engineering in this correspondences. You have the layout of the design of the bus bomb, and and all this stuff showing copper leaf springs, electronics knowledge, drafting. Arthur Lee Allen did not have those skill sets, and Don Cheney did. So that's just two things that stand out above for Don that had over Arthur Lee Allen. Arthur Lee Allen was completely bald by the time of these crimes, and the witness descriptions were that he was not, especially the Presidio. Donald Falk, the police officer that got the best look at him, said he had a widow's peak style hair, which is what Don Cheney had. So if Allen's at Lake Berryessa, it can't be him, because both victims saw hair coming through the eyelets of that Zodiac mask, where he was wearing that executioner's hood with the Zodiac cross circle over it. They could see brown hair coming through the eyelets of the mask. So if that's Arthur Lee Allen, he had to be wearing a wig, which would have been complete insanity to wear a wig under a black executioner hood where it could shift, and it does nothing to disguise his identity because he's already covered anyway. So it's a heavy process, but that's basically my theory. It was Don Cheney all along. Don Cheney's the only person in the case of the Zodiac Killer that inserted himself into the case he created. He's the only person that purely came along and said, I can help you. I know who this is. I'm going to help you out. It was my buddy, Arthur Lee Allen. And he tells you how he all went down through the guise of Arthur told me so. So that's, that's it in a nutshell. I think Cheney's the only person that can beat Allen, even in a side-by-side comparison, even for circumstantial evidence. I think Cheney can beat him.
Hmm. Yeah, I never heard his name before. Um, one thing that comes out in the movie, and of course, movies aren't always accurate, but one of the problems that's pointed out in the film is the difficulty in solving this case from the fact that there were multiple jurisdictions involved. There was San Francisco Police Department in Napa. So,
Napa, Vallejo,
yeah, what would you say about that?
and Benicia.
Did that make it
Um,
difficult to?
oh yeah, I think it made it harder. I think some people claim it was a little overblown at the time, that they weren't trying to help each other. But you didn't have the technology back then, and they didn't. I think by the time that Paul Stein was murdered, I think they realized that this was probably the same person, because he was claiming to be. And then you've had that first real tie between the letter writer and the killer, because obviously whoever killed Paul Stein had access to that bloody shirt. I know in the hoax theory, Professor Horn says that, oh, maybe Hal Snook had access to the San Francisco crime lab, because remember, Hal Snook's a Napa cop. He's not SFPD. He should not have been able to get in and freely have access to Paul Stein's bloody shirt. Actually, in the documentary, they talked to a gentleman that basically said there's no way that happened. So you have to get into things like that. But that was the first definitive link between the killer and the letter writer, because the shirt pieces came with letters that matched all the others. The handwriting on those letters that had the bloody shirt pieces were identical to earlier letters. So there was no reason to believe this is somebody else. This is either the killer or somebody that knew the killer, because how else would they have gotten Paul Stein's bloody shirt to mail in these 3 different correspondences? So that's just kind of the way it played out that way. So that's, I think, when they started believing, okay, now we know this guy's probably the one that did all 4. I think there was more sharing of information, but they were different. They went about things in different ways. I think Vallejo had a lot of interest in the case. It felt like a Vallejo crime, because Blue Rock Springs was technically the only crime in Vallejo. Laker Monroe was actually in Benicia, which is right next door. But I think they did try to share notes and get together on certain things. It just didn't pan out. And then, of course, each jurisdiction had their own copies of some of the letters. And you had SFPD had correspondences that were sent to the Chronicle, would wind up the possession of, as a San Francisco police, because they were sent to a newspaper there in the city. And the evidence was not handled or stored well, meaning letters and envelopes in this case, and Stein's shirt. They were kept in like a cardboard box. They were handled with bare hands. Of course, there was no DNA back then, so no one really thought they were contaminating anything. Officers were taking the letters home to show their families, saying, hey, look, this is real live Zodiac letters. And they would, the kids would literally pass them around the table. And at one point, they didn't even know where some of them were. One particular police officer took a bunch of them home and just threw them up on a shelf and forgot about it until they were found later. It was really atrocious the way the evidence was stored.
Well, no, you hinted at this. So if the Zodiac murders were happening today, we do have DNA evidence and maybe a whole different technology that we could bring to bear in a homicide investigation. Would the Zodiac case be easier to solve today?
Oh, it'd be far easier to solve today. It would either touch DNA or just a myriad of other the tactics they're doing. The more, like you said, just more communication between the different jurisdictions. The sketching. There's just only one sketch of the Zodiac, and it was basically from the memory of 3 young children that were looking at the Paul Stein attack after Paul Stein was shot at Presidio. There was 3 teenagers watching it from a 2nd-story window, and that's where that sketch comes from. It comes from young kids looking through a 2nd-story window at night. So how much detail you think you're going to have on it? That sketch could be anybody. I mean, it's basically useless. I think the sketch has actually done more harm than good. I think that something like that wouldn't have happened in more modern times. Obviously, DNA and different techniques that were used. I think they tried the best they could, but I think in this day and age, he most likely gets caught.
Yeah, unfortunate that didn't happen. let's see, what else? There was something else I was thinking about. Oh, what can you think of any other crime in the annals of American criminal history that hasn't been solved, that comes anywhere close to what happened with the Zodiac killings?
No, not really. There's different ones that are intriguing. The Lindbergh baby, things like that. But the Zodiac just has a lot of mystique about it because of the letters, the time period that it happened, the tauntingness of the letters, the ciphers, and the math involved, and it just the symbols used. The name Zodiac, he named himself, which was interesting. I mean, now we had the Golden State Killer was a pretty popular case. Of course, he got caught by
Mm.
genetic genealogy, of course, and because he was really careful not to get caught, but he couldn't foresee the future with the advances in DNA. But that just doesn't come near the mystique. I think DB Cooper is close. You just had my friend Bruce Smith on your show,
Yeah.
um,
Do you
who's
know
a big
Bruce?
influence on me. Yeah, Bruce is a good friend of mine.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, Bruce is an interesting guy, and I highly recommend your show with Bruce because we call all that he talks about, that the friends of Bruce, we call it the woo woo. When he really gets into the UFOs and stuff and all
Yeah,
that, I
he
love that
does.
about Bruce. Yeah, he's a great writer. Bruce is a great writer. He's not only a great storyteller, he's a fantastic writer. And he was a big influence on me in a lot of things, mainly the DB Cooper case, because he's considered the mayor of Cooperville because he was one of the first people writing about DB Cooper. But of course, DB Cooper didn't kill anybody, but it has mystique about it. Who was DB Cooper? It has that mystique. This guy with the dark glasses and the suit walking into the airport. 1971. He's still not identified to this day. I think it's similar to the Zodiac in terms of mystique. I would say that's the closest thing to Zodiac, so there's a lot of people that like to follow both cases closely.
Hmm. So what haven't we talked about as far as the Zodiac? What stone have we left unturned here or not unturned? You
You
think
know,
anything?
today I would say is what is the hope for the case being solved? I mean, there's different theories. People have different suspects. I mean, the joke is it gets solved 5 times a year. Uh, my hope would be that some kind of maybe touch DNA could be retrieved from some of the items. There was some bindings from Lake Berryessa. There's a company called Othram Labs, not far from me in the Woodlands, Texas, run by a guy named David Middleman, who is so cutting edge with DNA. He's the best at it in the world, is what this guy's doing now. Every time you turn on any kind of basic news channel or whatever, especially if it's crime related, you'll see case of missing John Doe just solved. Case of missing Jane Doe just solved. Well, this is all done by David Middleman at Othram Labs because he's found out a way to amplify DNA. Because every time you test DNA, it degrades, but he's found a way to amplify it and get good enough samples to do the genetic genealogy and to backtrack it, which he has people in house doing that. But this guy's solving every cold case in America right now. He's on fire, literally, doing this stuff. So I would hope what I would do is gather everything up. And I know a lot of other people have touched it, but just to come up with some kind of part of one of the letter flaps or something and get it to the best in the world, which is this gentleman in the Woodlands, Texas, because no one's close to this guy. And I communicate with him some, and just put all that in a box and send it to the guy. That's where this case needs to go right now, because it's really our only hope of ever getting something definitive. And if that comes back to a known suspect, great. If it comes back to somebody that may have known one of the suspects, great. Maybe we could take it from there. Vallejo PD had famously sent off their letters because they had their own letters that were sent to the Vallejo Times Herald, went to obviously turned over to Vallejo Police Department. They sent all their letters for some advanced testing 4 or 5 years ago, and nothing came back. They were not able to get anything off of them that we know of. There was rumors that the DNA, they did get a good DNA sample off of one that came back to belong to a woman. Well, we know Zodiac wasn't a woman, so we don't know if they just didn't get a good sample or a bad one, or what happened. But that's really the only, other than the hood showing up in someone's attic, which I don't think is going to happen. It's long gone. Let's face it. I think we need to get all that stuff over to this guy because he's that good at it. There's no one close, and hope for it. But all this stuff costs money. And frankly, Vallejo PD in San Francisco PD and Napa PD are not thinking about this case every day. They have new cases. There's new murders. It's over 50 years old. It's a famous case, but it's not their first priority. And it costs money to test all this stuff. Even, even if he had a big interest in it, it would still
Well,
cost money.
and would you likely say that the actual Zodiac murderer is dead by now?
Oh, long, yeah. I believe he died in 2009, but I think whoever he was would be dead. Whoever you believe he was is most likely dead, because you're talking about someone that really should have been in their early 30s by the time of Lake Herman Road. And we know that because of phrases he used and knowledge he had. I mean, you could have been a really smart 18, 19-year-old, but you're not going to have the life experience or the trained knowledge that I think Zodiac had. And this is something I think also could be done, is people that really look at this. And I work with about 4 or 5 guys that we collaborate with in a group. And some of them come in just from the outside. They like my theory, or they try to stay neutral and not be a suspect guy, because once you're a suspect guy, you get kind of labeled, unfortunately. But I'm willing to take that. But they look at things like, did this person actually have celestial navigation knowledge? Like textbook, was it learned? My suspect had it. My suspect could draft. He had all that. My suspect was an avid big game hunter. He could wield a knife. He liked making custom knives and sheaths for knives. He was an avid sewer. He could have sewn that logo onto the executioner's hood at Lake Berryessa, which Brian Hartnell said it was done with care. This wasn't just slapped on with paint. And you couldn't take that to your local seamstress. They'd be like, what is this? Somebody that could sew. They had a sewing ability, a good sewing ability. I'm sure some men can sew, but this was done very well. An avid sewer. We have a lot of that. There's circumstantial evidence in this case for a lot of suspects. I think mine has the best, but other people could argue theirs. But I think it's trying to really clamp down on what skills are here. And, some of these clues could be red herrings, like the Zodiac claimed to like the Gilbert Sullivan played the Mikado. He quoted it in 2 of his letters. Did he actually like Gilbert and Sullivan, or did he just see it once and thought it'd be cool to throw into a letter? That stuff is constantly being batted back and forth in this case. Comic books, we think that a lot of people think, no matter who their suspect is, think the Zodiac was really influenced by early comics from the late 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Because you have the phrase, this is the Zodiac speaking. You have the executioner's hood. He used the phrase by fire, by gun, by rope, which comes from the Wheel of Death from the Tim Holt comic book, which was, Cowboys and Indians type comics. Red Rider was one, where one of his symbols shows up in a Red Rider comic. So most people are of the belief that he was heavily influenced by comics and all sorts of things. Alfred Hitchcock. There's an Alfred Hitchcock episode called Museum Piece, which most people are in agreement he saw that episode, because it shows a guy with attaching a flashlight to a gun, which is something the Zodiac talked about. So, we're constantly looking at all this over and over and thinking what else is going to come up. Of course, nothing huge has happened since the 340 was solved, but and there are ciphers that were unsolved, by the way. There's one that's called the Z32. It's only 32 symbols. And according to the guys that broke the 340, they say it's actually impossible to break a cipher that small, because there's so many possibilities that could fit into it without having the key that would go to it, which we'll never have. They say it's impossible to break. So there's not going to be another cipher solved, unfortunately, because they're all too small.
You have a website, right?
Yes, I have a YouTube channel.
What that website is.
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel. It's called Drew Beeson and True Crime and Missing People. And then my website is drewbeesonbooks.com.
And we can find your book about the Zodiac and anything else you've written at the same site, correct?
Yes, they're all on there. Yes, they're all on Amazon, and then the website will take you there.
Okay. Drew, thanks. This has been an education about the Zodiac, and I really appreciate your time. And I'll say hello to Bruce Smith for you.
Say hello to Bruce. That was a great show. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. I'd never heard the Selma Hayek story. That was hilarious. I love Bruce. That's what makes Bruce is just a national treasure to me. I love Bruce Smith. And for stories like that, I'd never heard the Selma Hayek story.
Yeah.
That's just what makes the guy so special. I mean, he's such a great writer. His life experience is so awesome. And it sounds like he's decided to stay in the PNW, which he wasn't going to do. He retired from uh, all things DB Cooper and kind of passed the torch, which that'll never fully happen. He was too involved with the Cooper case for too long to do that. But he would planned on relocating somewhere else. But it sounds like he's going to stay up there in the Great Pacific Northwest, which I'm really happy about if that's what he does.
Not a bad place to stay.
Yeah, it's just perfect for him.
Thank you very much for your time. We'll let you know when we get this edited and up on our website.
Great. Appreciate it, Jams. A lot of fun.
Yeah, take care.
You too.